Hello, I'm 𝗏𝒁𝗶𝗆𝗆, founder of Starlit Contracts, where we help you to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, even if you're not legally trained. And in this video, we're looking at definitions. Let's look at the topic of definitions in summary now. And firstly, what is it and how does it work? Well, definitions is much like having a dictionary. You open up a dictionary, it's got a list of words in there, and next to each of those words, you've got a description of what it means. So when you have a contract and you start on the first page, perhaps you've got the contract date, then the contract parties, followed by the recitals or the whereas provisions, and that's normally followed by clause 1 and a list of definitions. A practical example of this in a contract is that one or both of the parties might want to refer to their representatives a number of times in the contract. And by representatives, they mean their professional advisors, their directors, their employees. They might even be referring to their subcontractors. So in this case, the parties probably don't want to repeat that list of representatives over and over and over again in the contract itself. So instead that they can have a definition in clause 1 of representatives with a capital R and list all those parties directly next to it, and then you just repeat that word representatives with a capital R every time you need it in the contract. Is this something that you should care about? Absolutely. The thing is that if you're reading a clause, you might have a natural interpretation of that clause which takes you in a certain direction. But if there's a defined term used in that clause, you need to check that definition, because the thing is that the definition can very significantly change the natural interpretation of that clause. So stay alert and make sure you're checking those definitions. Now to a practical example of dealing with definitions. Customer Limited wants to sign a contract with Supplier Limited for the first time. Customer Limited insists on using its standard contract and wants it signed immediately. This is so often the case. It's a rush to get the deal done with deliverables in the short term, potentially. Supplier Limited does not have time to review the contract fully, including 5 pages of definitions. Look, some contracts do have an awful lot of definitions. I've seen contracts with up to 20 pages of definitions, although it was a very, very complicated deal indeed. But very often you see contracts with only a few definitions in them. So it varies enormously depending on the needs of that contract and who wrote it. What can go right for the parties in this situation? Well, let's say that the definitions are reasonable. There's not an excessive amount of definitions for the complexity of the deal. Let's also say that those definitions are taking a reasonable approach. They're not trying to change the approach that's taken in any one of the clauses, and the definitions themselves are clear. So in this situation, it's a reasonable outcome that you could probably achieve there. The parties enter into a deal and can implement that deal consistent with their understanding at the time of the negotiation. But what could go wrong on the other hand? Well, let's say the definitions are excessive. With 5 pages, it would probably have to be a very complex deal. So if it's not a complex deal, then there being 5 pages probably makes you think they've gone a bit overboard here. And those definitions potentially have a number of cross-references between them, or they might even change the natural interpretation of some of the clauses in the contract. So this is elevating the level of complexity and uncertainty for both of the parties, and it increases the chances of a dispute during performance of the contract. Now to a sample clause and some key considerations in relation to it. And firstly, we're going to look at a limitation of liability clause that uses a definition. So the liability clause states, Supplier Limited's liability is capped at $1 million or whatever currency you use for your own contract, except in case of willful misconduct. So on face value, we might think, okay, there's a cap on liability of $1 million, and maybe that's a fair amount, let's say, based on the value of the deal and any insurance that the parties might have in place. But then there's this carve-out in case of willful misconduct. So if, for example, I'm guilty of willful misconduct, that means that the liability for it would be uncapped. And I might conclude, actually, that seems kind of fair. If I'm deliberately doing something that I know is going to cause you harm, then it kind of makes sense that my liability wouldn't be capped. So I can decide that that's a fair outcome. But we notice that willful misconduct is a defined term. So we would have to look at the definition section to see how is it defined and does that impact on the clause. So upon turning to the definition section, we see willful misconduct means a breach of contract, negligence, or liability under any other legal theory. And suddenly we decide, wait, hang on there, this completely changes the effect of this limitation of liability clause. Because with a willful misconduct, I might be thinking about a reckless disregard for consequences which I knew would be severe and harmful to the other party, or potentially severe and harmful. Here the definition of willful misconduct means pretty much everything. So now it's uncertain what liability is in fact capped under the limitation of liability clause. Potentially nothing, which renders the clause pretty much ineffective for me and very much becomes something that we would want to negotiate. I hope you found that video helpful, and if so, you can access the entire Build the Foundation in Contracts program on our website starlitcontracts.com. Remember to comment below if there's content that you would like to see in an upcoming video. See you next time.